Tonight we'll explore 5 chilling tales: the curse of the ceramic mask, the spirit in the tea house, the vengeful ghost of unrequited love, the cursed geisha cabin in the forest, and the kimono that steals souls. Subscribe to the channel and let's begin. In the remote village of Akemi in 1859, whispers spoke of a cursed ceramic mask that had claimed the souls of 3 generations, its sorrowful expression hiding a malevolent spirit that hungered for freedom. The mask, with its delicate porcelain features frozen in eternal despair, sat in the shrine room of the village's most revered geisha house, where locals claimed you could hear weeping on windless nights. You arrive in Akemi as autumn mist clings to the thatched roofs and narrow pathways, drawn by reports of supernatural disturbances that have plagued this isolated mountain community for decades. The village sits in a valley where ancient traditions run deeper than mountain springs, and where certain objects hold power that modern minds struggle to comprehend. The ceramic mask, known locally as Kanashimi no Kamen, the mask of sorrow, occupies a place of fearful reverence in the collective consciousness of every resident. The mask belongs to the Hanabiriya, the cherry blossom house, where the legendary geisha Tomoe once performed for feudal lords and wealthy merchants. Tomoe's beauty was said to be so extraordinary that men would travel for weeks just to glimpse her face. But her story ended in tragedy when she died under mysterious circumstances, her final performance interrupted by screams that echoed through the valley for 3 days. The mask was crafted as a memorial to her artistry, but those who commissioned it soon discovered they had created something far more dangerous than a simple tribute. You enter the Hanabiriya through sliding doors that whisper against their tracks like sighs from the past. The interior maintains the elegant simplicity of traditional architecture, with tatami mats that smell of rush grass and aged wood beams that have witnessed centuries of human drama. But your attention is immediately drawn to the shrine room at the building's heart, where the ceramic mask rests on a lacquered pedestal surrounded by offerings of wilted flowers and cold tea that no one remembers placing there. The mask itself is a masterpiece of artistic craftsmanship, its features so lifelike they seem to breathe in the flickering candlelight. The ceramic has been glazed to perfection, creating skin tones that shift between ivory and gold depending on the angle of observation. But it's the expression that captures your attention, a face frozen in such profound sadness that looking at it directly causes an involuntary tightening in your chest. The eyes, though empty sockets, seem to track your movement with an intelligence that ceramic should not possess. Yuki, the current caretaker of the Hanabiriya, approaches with the careful steps of someone who has learned to move quietly around sleeping predators. Her own painted face shows the strain of living in constant proximity to supernatural forces, with lines of worry that her cosmetics cannot entirely conceal. She speaks in hushed tones about the mask's history, how it was created by a master ceramicist who claimed the clay itself wept during the firing process, and how everyone involved in its creation met untimely ends within a year of its completion. The young apprentice who triggered the current crisis stands in the corner of the shrine room, his hands still bandaged from his attempt to destroy the mask. Kenji's eyes hold the hollow look of someone who has seen beyond the veil of ordinary reality and found horrors waiting there. He tells you how the mask called to him in dreams for weeks, whispering promises of relief from the sorrow that seemed to emanate from its ceramic features. When he finally raised the hammer, intending to shatter what he believed was simply an object of morbid fascination, the world itself seemed to recoil from his action. The moment Kenji's hammer struck the mask, though it left no visible damage, reality in Akemi shifted in ways that residents are still struggling to understand. The light in the shrine room didn't simply dim, it became thick and viscous, like trying to see through honey. Temperature dropped so suddenly that breath became visible in crystalline puffs, and sounds took on a quality that suggested they were traveling through some medium denser than air. Most disturbing of all, voices began to whisper from within the mask itself, speaking in dialects so ancient that understanding came through feeling rather than comprehension. You spend your first night in the village documenting the phenomena that have intensified since Kenji's attempt at destruction. As darkness falls, the mask seems to grow more active, its ceramic surface occasionally showing what appears to be movement beneath the glaze. Residents report seeing a geisha wandering the village streets, a figure of impossible beauty whose eyes are empty voids that reflect nothing, not even moonlight. This apparition moves with the fluid grace that defined Tomoe's legendary performances, but her presence brings only despair to those who encounter her. The negative energy emanating from the mask manifests in increasingly dramatic ways as the night progresses. Candles throughout the village extinguish themselves without any apparent cause, leaving families huddled in darkness that seems to press against windows and doors like a living thing. Shadows gather in corners with unnatural density, forming shapes that suggest watching figures before dissolving when directly observed. Children wake screaming from dreams they cannot describe, while adults find themselves weeping without understanding why. The village's animals provide the clearest indication of the supernatural disturbance plaguing Akemi. Dogs refuse to enter certain areas, whining and backing away from invisible barriers that seem to surround the Hanabiriya in expanding circles. Cats disappear entirely, and those that return show signs of trauma that veterinary knowledge cannot explain. Even insects avoid the shrine room, creating an unnatural silence that makes every small sound echo with ominous significance. Buddhist monk Joran arrives from a distant monastery, summoned by urgent messages describing supernatural disturbances that threaten to overwhelm the village's spiritual defenses. His weathered face and calm demeanor speak of decades spent confronting forces that exist beyond ordinary understanding. The tools he carries, blessed incense, prayer beads worn smooth by countless ceremonies, and sutras copied in his own careful handwriting, represent humanity's ancient arsenal against malevolent supernatural entities. You observe Joran's initial assessment of the situation as he moves through the Hanabiriya with the confidence of someone who has faced similar challenges before. His trained senses immediately detect the layers of spiritual contamination that have accumulated around the mask over generations. He explains how certain objects can become vessels for supernatural consciousness, accumulating power through emotional resonance and traumatic events, until they develop a form of artificial sentience that mimics life while remaining fundamentally hostile to it. The monk's preliminary rituals begin at sunset, when the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds traditionally becomes most permeable. You watch as he arranges blessed candles in specific patterns around the shrine room, their flames burning with unusual steadiness despite the supernatural turbulence that has been disrupting normal combustion throughout the village. The incense he lights produces smoke that moves in defiance of air currents, forming spirals and geometric patterns that seem to create barriers of purified atmosphere around the cursed mask. As Joran begins his chanted prayers, the mask responds with manifestations that confirm your worst fears about its true nature. The ceramic surface begins to show stress fractures that appear and disappear like breathing, while the temperature in the shrine room fluctuates wildly between Arctic cold and oppressive heat. Most disturbing of all, the whispers that have plagued the village since Kenji's attack intensify into a chorus of voices speaking in overlapping languages that span centuries of human civilization. The entity trapped within the mask reveals more of its nature as the monk's cleansing ceremony intensifies. Through the whispered voices and visual manifestations, you begin to understand that this is not simply the spirit of the deceased geisha Tomoe, but something far older and more dangerous that has used her identity as camouflage. The true entity appears to be a fragment of primordial consciousness that existed before human civilization, a hungry intelligence that feeds on emotional energy and has learned to disguise itself as familiar forms to attract prey. Joran's chanting reaches a crescendo as he attempts to sever the spiritual anchors that bind the entity to the physical world through the ceramic mask. The air in the shrine room becomes visible, swirling with energies that make your eyes water and your skin crawl with sensations like insects walking across your flesh. The monk's voice echoes with harmonics that seem to originate from sources beyond his physical throat, suggesting that he is channeling power from spiritual allies who exist in dimensions adjacent to our own reality. The climactic moment of the ceremony arrives when Joran focuses his accumulated spiritual energy into a direct confrontation with the entity. You witness what can only be described as a battle fought on multiple levels of existence simultaneously, with the monk's blessed incense creating clouds of purified atmosphere that the entity cannot penetrate, while his prayers form barriers of sanctified sound that prevent the malevolent intelligence from escaping its ceramic prison. The mask itself becomes a focal point for energies that make the air around it shimmer like heat waves rising from sun-baked stone. For a terrifying moment, it appears that the entity might succeed in breaking free from the restraints that have held it for generations. The mask levitates several inches above its pedestal, rotating slowly while emitting a sound like breaking glass played in reverse. The temperature drops so precipitously that frost begins forming on every surface in the shrine room, and the candles flicker with flames that burn blue-white instead of their normal yellow. You feel the presence of something vast and hungry pressing against the boundaries of reality, seeking any weakness that would allow it to fully manifest in the physical world. But Joran's decades of spiritual training and the power of the sacred texts he channels prove sufficient to contain the supernatural outbreak. His final prayer, spoken in Sanskrit so ancient that the words seem to reshape reality through their pronunciation alone, creates a binding that forces the entity back into dormancy within the ceramic mask. The whispers fade to barely audible murmurs, the temperature returns to normal ranges, and the oppressive atmosphere that has plagued the village begins to dissipate like morning mist touched by sunlight. The ceremony's apparent success brings immediate relief to the residents of Akemi, who emerge from their homes to find that candles burn normally again and shadows behave according to natural laws. Children sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks, while adults report that the constant sense of being watched has finally lifted. The monk declares the immediate crisis resolved, but his warnings about the temporary nature of the containment cast shadows over the celebration of the village's deliverance. You remain in Akemi for several days after the ceremony, documenting the gradual return to normalcy while watching for signs that the entity might still pose a threat. The mask sits motionless on its pedestal, showing no obvious signs of supernatural activity, but careful observation reveals subtle indicators that the creature within has not been destroyed, merely forced into a deeper state of hibernation. Occasionally, you catch glimpses of movement beneath the ceramic surface, like something stirring in the depths of a still pond. Joran's departure marks the end of the immediate crisis, but his parting words carry warnings that chill you more than the supernatural cold that previously filled the shrine room. He explains that entities of this type are essentially immortal, capable of waiting centuries or even millennia for opportunities to escape their prisons. The binding he has created will hold for years, possibly decades, but it is not permanent. Future generations will need to maintain the spiritual barriers through regular ceremonies and constant vigilance, lest the mask's prisoner find ways to erode its supernatural restraints. The residents of Akemi attempt to return to their normal lives, but the experience has left permanent changes in their community's spiritual ecosystem. Some villagers report enhanced sensitivity to supernatural phenomena, able to perceive things that remained hidden before their exposure to the mask's influence. Others find that their dreams now carry visions of places and times that do not belong to their personal experience. Time is too misted, suggesting that contact with the entity has created psychic connections that transcend normal human consciousness. Yuki, as caretaker of the Hanabiraya, assumes the burden of monitoring the mask for signs of renewed activity. Her daily routine now includes offerings and prayers designed to reinforce the monk's binding, but you can see the toll this responsibility takes on her mental and physical health. She ages visibly during your stay, as if proximity to the contained entity drains vitality even through the spiritual barriers that hold it in check. Your final night in Akemi provides disturbing evidence that the entity remains far from defeated. As you maintain vigil in the shrine room, you observe phenomena that suggest the creature is already beginning to test the boundaries of its new prison. The mask's ceramic surface shows hairline cracks that appear and disappear too quickly for normal vision to track, while temperature fluctuations create condensation patterns on nearby surfaces that form symbols reminiscent of ancient magical scripts. Most troubling of all, you begin to hear whispers that seem to originate from within your own mind, rather than from any external source. The voice speaks in your native language, demonstrating an intelligence capable of adapting its communication methods to each individual it encounters. It speaks of loneliness, of centuries spent trapped in ceramic darkness, of the simple desire for freedom that any sentient being would naturally crave. The entity's words are carefully chosen to evoke sympathy rather than fear, suggesting a sophistication that makes it far more dangerous than a simple malevolent spirit. As you prepare to leave Akemi, you carry with you the knowledge that the village's reprieve is temporary at best. The entity within the ceramic mask has demonstrated patience measured in generations, cunning that allows it to adapt to changing circumstances, and power that even experienced spiritual practitioners struggle to contain. The residents of Akemi will live with the constant awareness that their salvation depends on maintaining barriers that grow weaker with each passing year, while the creature they guard grows more familiar with the nature of its prison. The mask sits in its shrine room, surrounded by offerings and prayers, its sorrowful expression unchanged by the recent crisis. But you now understand that the sadness carved into those ceramic features is not a memorial to human tragedy. It is the face the entity wears to disguise its true nature. Behind that mask of sorrow lies an intelligence that views human consciousness as nothing more than fuel for its own existence, waiting with infinite patience for the moment when someone will be foolish enough to grant it the freedom it has sought for centuries. Your departure from Akemi carries the weight of unfinished business and unanswered questions. The village may be safe for now, but the entity's whispered promises of return echo in your memory like threats spoken in a language older than human civilization. Somewhere in the depths of ceramic darkness, something that should not exist continues to wait, to plan, and to dream of the day when it will walk freely under skies that have forgotten the names of the gods who once held it in check. The curse of the ceramic mask serves as a reminder that some prisons are not punishment but protection, that some artifacts are too dangerous to destroy and too powerful to ignore, and that the price of eternal vigilance is sometimes the only thing standing between humanity and forces that would remake reality according to their own incomprehensible desires. In the end, the greatest horror may be the realization that victory against such entities is never permanent, only postponed until the next generation must face the same terrible choices and bear the same impossible burdens. In the mountain village of Wamura, in 1864, the ancient tea house known as Sharani An had served travelers for 3 centuries until the night when invisible footsteps began echoing through its empty halls, accompanied by the muffled voice of a geisha who had died there 40 years earlier, her spirit unable to find peace among the shadows she once graced with beauty. The locals whispered that her ghostly presence grew stronger with each passing season, transforming their beloved sanctuary into a place where the living feared to linger after sunset. You arrive in Wamura as the first snow of winter begins to dust the mountain peaks that surround this isolated village. The tea house sits at the center of the community, like a wooden heart pumping memories through the veins of narrow streets that connect modest homes and ancient shrines. Shiranean, meaning White Summit Hermitage, was built in the architectural style that maximizes harmony with the natural landscape, its curved rooflines echoing the mountain silhouettes while its weathered wooden walls blend seamlessly with the surrounding forest. The tea house's reputation for supernatural activity began 4 decades ago with the tragic death of Yukina, a traveling geisha who had sought shelter during a particularly harsh winter storm. She possessed extraordinary beauty and artistic skill that drew admirers from across the region. But her life ended suddenly when she choked on a bone during what should have been a celebratory meal marking the end of the storm. Her death was so unexpected, so contrary to the joy and artistic triumph that had defined her final performance, that those present claimed her spirit seemed confused, unwilling to accept the abrupt termination of her earthly existence. You enter the tea house through sliding doors that stick slightly in their tracks, as if the building itself resists the intrusion of the living into spaces that have become the domain of the dead. The interior maintains the spare elegance that defines traditional tea house architecture, with tatami mats that smell of aged grass and wooden beams darkened by centuries of incense smoke. But there's an undercurrent of unease in the atmosphere, a sense that you're being observed by eyes that exist beyond the range of normal vision. Oshige, the current proprietress of the tea house, greets you with the formal courtesy expected of her position, but her movements carry the careful deliberation of someone who has learned to navigate an environment where unexpected disturbances are commonplace. Her graying hair is arranged in a simple style that speaks of practical concerns rather than aesthetic ambition, and her kimono, while clean and well-maintained, shows the subtle signs of someone whose attention is constantly divided between worldly duties and supernatural vigilance. The manifestations of Yukina's presence follow patterns that have become as regular as the changing seasons over the past 40 years. Each evening as sunset approaches, the tea house begins to fill with sounds that have no visible source: the whisper of silk against tatami, the delicate clink of porcelain cups being arranged for service, and most distinctively, the muffled voice of a woman humming melodies that belong to Yukina's repertoire. These auditory phenomena always begin softly, barely distinguishable from the natural settling sounds of an old wooden building, but gradually intensify until they become impossible to ignore. You spend your first night in the tea house documenting the supernatural manifestations that have made it notorious throughout the region. As darkness falls, the temperature in certain rooms drops noticeably, creating pockets of Arctic air that make breath visible despite the warmth from the central hearth. The sound of footsteps begins around midnight, sometimes the light measured steps of a geisha moving through formal choreography, other times heavier movements that suggest someone searching urgently through rooms and corridors for something that can never be found. The ghostly presence seems most active in the room where Yukina died, a chamber that has been preserved exactly as it was on that fatal night 4 decades ago. The low table still bears the dishes from which she ate her final meal, now permanently empty but arranged with perfect precision. Cushions remain positioned as they were when she collapsed, their indentations suggesting the presence of invisible occupants. Most unsettling of all, the room's mirrors occasionally show reflections that don't correspond to anyone present. Glimpses of a beautiful woman in elaborate dress who appears to be perpetually preparing for a performance that will never come. The supernatural disturbances extend beyond mere auditory and visual phenomena to include manifestations that affect the physical environment in measurable ways. Flowers placed in the memorial alcove dedicated to Yukina's memory wilt and revive, according to patterns that correspond to her emotional state, blooming magnificently when her spirit seems content but withering instantly during episodes of supernatural agitation. Tea ceremonies conducted in her presence result in water that boils at impossible temperatures and flavors that carry subtle notes of sadness, as if the ghost's emotions somehow infuse themselves into the very molecules of the beverages being prepared. The village's children provide the most reliable barometer of supernatural activity, their sensitivity to spiritual presence allowing them to detect fluctuations in the ghost's manifestations before adults become aware of them. They report seeing a beautiful lady in elaborate dress walking through the tea house gardens during daylight hours, her translucent form moving among the carefully tended plants with the grace that defined her earthly existence. But they also describe episodes when this same figure appears distressed, her ghostly movements becoming agitated as she searches through rooms and corridors with increasing desperation. Local authorities, faced with reports of supernatural harassment that threaten to drive away the travelers upon whom Wamura's economy depends, finally summoned Yamamoto-sensei, an elderly curandero whose reputation for dealing with restless spirits extended throughout the mountain provinces. His arrival in the village creates a mixture of hope and apprehension among residents who have grown accustomed to Yukina's presence, fearing that attempts at banishment might anger the ghost and intensify rather than resolve the supernatural disturbances. Yamamoto-sensei's initial assessment of the situation reveals the complex spiritual dynamics that have developed around Yukina's death and subsequent haunting. His weathered hands tremble not from age but from sensitivity to the supernatural energies that permeate the tea house, while his rheumy eyes see layers of reality that remain hidden from ordinary perception. He explains that certain deaths, particularly those that occur during moments of intense emotional or artistic fulfillment, can create spiritual anchors that bind consciousness to physical locations with extraordinary tenacity. The curandero's approach to the supernatural problem differs significantly from the dramatic exorcism rituals employed by Buddhist monks or Shinto priests. Instead of attempting to banish Yukina's spirit through force or religious authority, he seeks to understand the nature of her spiritual confusion and address the underlying causes that prevent her from completing her journey to the afterlife. His method involves communication rather than confrontation, treating the ghost as a person in distress rather than a supernatural threat to be eliminated. You observe the beginning of Yamamoto-sensei's intervention as he moves through the tea house at dawn, when the boundary between night and day traditionally offers optimal conditions for spiritual communication. His trembling hands scatter herbs whose smoke creates patterns that seem to respond to invisible air currents, while his whispered mantras produce harmonics that resonate with frequencies beyond normal human hearing. The very atmosphere in the building begins to change, becoming thicker and more charged, as if reality itself is being prepared for supernatural contact. The first direct manifestation of Yukina's spirit occurs when Yamamoto-sensei enters the room where she died, his presence apparently triggering a response that has been building for decades. The ghost materializes gradually, her form beginning as little more than a disturbance in the air, before gradually acquiring the translucent appearance of a beautiful woman in elaborate dress. Her expression carries the confused sadness of someone who understands that she has died, but cannot comprehend why her consciousness persists in a world where she no longer belongs. The communication between the living curandero and the dead geisha unfolds through methods that transcend ordinary language, involving gestures, expressions, and spiritual emanations that convey meaning more directly than spoken words. Yamamoto-sensei's mantras create a bridge of sanctified sound that allows safe contact between dimensions, while his ritual movements mirror the graceful choreography that defined Yukina's artistic practice, establishing common ground that enables mutual understanding. Through this supernatural dialogue, the true cause of Yukina's spiritual imprisonment gradually becomes clear. Her death occurred at the moment of her greatest artistic triumph, when she had achieved a perfect synthesis of technical skill and emotional expression that represented the culmination of years of training and practice. The abrupt termination of her life at this peak moment created a spiritual paradox. Her consciousness remained anchored to the physical world by the intensity of her artistic achievement, unable to release its attachment to the very excellence that had defined her existence. Yamamoto-sensei's intervention focuses on helping Yukina's spirit understand that artistic perfection is by nature transient, that the beauty she achieved in her final performance was meant to be experienced and then released rather than grasped and preserved. His mantras carry teachings about the impermanent nature of all phenomena, while his ritual movements demonstrate how grace and beauty can be honored without being possessed, appreciated without being controlled. The climactic moment of the spiritual healing occurs when the curandero guides Yukina through a symbolic recreation of her final performance, allowing her to complete the artistic expression that was interrupted by death. Her ghostly form moves through choreography that combines elements from her earthly repertoire with gestures that seem to originate from spiritual dimensions beyond human experience. The dance becomes both memorial and farewell, a final artistic statement that allows her consciousness to release its attachment to physical existence. As the ritual reaches its conclusion, marked by the curandero's most complex mantras and the release of herbal smoke that fills the tea house with purified atmosphere, you witness the gradual dissolution of Yukina's supernatural presence. Her ghostly form becomes increasingly translucent before finally fading entirely. But her departure is accompanied by sensations of peace and completion rather than the violent disruption typically associated with forced exorcisms. The very air in the building feels lighter, cleansed of the spiritual tension that has accumulated over 40 years of supernatural manifestation. The immediate aftermath of the ritual brings profound changes to the tea house's atmosphere, with the oppressive sense of being watched finally lifting from rooms that have felt haunted for decades. Temperature fluctuations cease, mirrors reflect only the images of those actually present, and the mysterious sounds that have plagued nighttime hours fade into the natural settling noises of an old wooden building. Oshige moves through her duties with visible relief, her movements no longer constrained by the careful vigilance that supernatural presence had required. But even as the supernatural manifestations diminish, subtle signs suggest that the spiritual cleansing is not entirely complete. Certain rooms retain a faint coolness that has no obvious source, while flowers in the memorial alcove continue to bloom with unusual vibrancy, as if some residual spiritual energy persists despite the ghost's apparent departure. Most tellingly, visitors to the tea house occasionally report glimpses of movement in their peripheral vision, suggestions of graceful figures that vanish when observed directly. Yamamoto-sensei's explanation for these lingering phenomena reveals the complex nature of spiritual attachment and release. While Yukina's conscious spirit has been helped to complete its journey to the afterlife, the intensity of emotion and artistic achievement associated with her final performance has left permanent imprints on the tea house's spiritual atmosphere. These residual energies, while no longer constituting an active haunting, serve as a kind of memorial to the beauty and tragedy that once unfolded within these walls. The curandero's departure from Wamura marks the end of the acute supernatural crisis, but his warnings about the temporary nature of the spiritual solution echo in the memories of those who witnessed his intervention. He explains that places where intense emotions have been experienced retain sensitivity to supernatural influence indefinitely, making them potential focal points for future manifestations if proper spiritual maintenance is not maintained. The tea house will require regular cleansing rituals and careful attention to the balance between honoring the past and releasing attachment to it. Your final days in Wamura provide opportunity to observe the village's adjustment to the changes in their historic tea house. Some residents express relief at the end of the supernatural disturbances, while others admit to missing the sense of connection to their cultural heritage that Yukina's presence provided. The ghost, despite the fear she inspired, had served as a living link to the artistic traditions and historical continuity that defined their mountain community's identity. The tea house gradually returns to its original function as a gathering place for travelers and local residents, but the experience of haunting has left subtle changes in how people interact with the space. Conversations carry an undercurrent of reverence that acknowledges the tragedy and beauty that once unfolded here, while artistic performances are conducted with particular attention to the spiritual as well as aesthetic dimensions of creative expression. Your departure from Wamura carries with it the understanding that the boundary between life and death, between past and present, remains more permeable than modern rationality typically acknowledges. The story of Yukina and the tea house serves as a reminder that places where intense human emotions have been experienced retain a kind of memory that can persist long after the original events have passed into history, requiring ongoing care and attention to prevent the accumulation of spiritual disturbances. The successful resolution of the haunting represents not victory over supernatural forces, but rather the restoration of harmony between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Yamamoto-sensei's intervention demonstrated that ghosts are often not malevolent entities to be feared and banished, but confused souls requiring compassion and understanding to complete their spiritual journeys. The true horror lies not in the presence of the supernatural but in the failure to recognize the human needs that persist beyond death. In the end, the tea house stands as both monument and cautionary tale. A reminder that artistic beauty can transcend the boundaries of mortality, while also acknowledging the importance of releasing attachment to even the most perfect moments of human achievement. The spirit that once haunted its halls has found peace, but the memory of her presence continues to inspire both respect for the power of artistic expression and awareness of the spiritual responsibilities that come with creating and preserving spaces where beauty and tragedy intersect. In the merchant district of Edo in 1851, locals whispered of Hiroshi, a young silk trader whose obsessive love for the geisha Sayuri became so consuming that when his heart failed during their final meeting, his spirit refused to accept death, returning as a vengeful force that would terrorize the floating world for decades to come. They say his ghost rose from his grave on the third night, his translucent form still trembling with the same desperate passion that had killed his mortal body. You arrive in the district as winter settles over the narrow streets, drawn by reports of supernatural attacks targeting the renowned Yoshiwara Pleasure Quarter. The cobblestones beneath your feet are slick with frost, but even colder is the atmosphere of fear that has settled over the tea houses in Okia, where geisha once moved with confidence through their nightly routines. Now they travel in groups, their painted faces betraying terror that no amount of professional training can fully conceal. The story begins in the spring of 1851, when Hiroshi first laid eyes on Sayuri performing at the prestigious Sakurate tea house. His wealth, inherited from a family textile business, allowed him to frequent the pleasure quarters regularly. But something about Sayuri's ethereal beauty and melancholy grace struck him with an intensity that transcended mere attraction. From that first evening, his visits became obsessive, his spending grew reckless, and his behavior took on the desperate quality of a man drowning in emotions he could not control. Sayuri, whose professional name meant Small Lily, was known throughout Edo for her mastery of classical dance and her ability to embody the fleeting beauty that defined the aesthetic philosophy of Mono no Aware. Her performances spoke of cherry blossoms falling, of seasons changing, of the bittersweet nature of existence itself. But Hiroshi saw in her not a symbol of impermanence but an object of eternal devotion, someone whose beauty he believed could anchor his soul against the uncertainties of mortal life. You enter the Sakurate through sliding doors that still bear scratches from supernatural manifestations that began shortly after Hiroshi's death. The interior maintains its elegant appointments, silk cushions arranged around low tables, painted screens depicting scenes of natural beauty, and alcoves displaying seasonal flower arrangements. But the atmosphere carries an undercurrent of tension that makes conversation difficult and laughter forced. Staff members move with the careful steps of people who have learned to watch shadows for signs of movement that shouldn't exist. The proprietress, Madame Okiku, greets you with the formal politeness expected of her position, but her eyes dart nervously toward the private room where Hiroshi died. She speaks in carefully measured tones about the night that changed everything, when the young merchant's increasingly erratic behavior reached its climax during what would prove to be his final meeting with Sayuri. His death came suddenly, a massive heart failure brought on by emotional stress that doctors struggled to explain in someone so young and apparently healthy. Witnesses to Hiroshi's final moments describe a scene of horrifying intensity. He had been pleading with Sayuri to abandon her professional life and marry him, offering increasingly extravagant sums of money and making promises that revealed his complete misunderstanding of the geisha world's complex social structures. When she gently but firmly declined his proposal, explaining the impossibility of his request, his face contorted with anguish that seemed to transcend normal human emotion. His hands began trembling uncontrollably, his breathing became labored, and he collapsed, clutching his chest while speaking her name with his dying breath. The supernatural manifestations began exactly 72 hours after Hiroshi's burial in the merchant cemetery outside the city. Sayuri, who had maintained her professional composure during the funeral proceedings, started experiencing episodes where she would find herself walking through dark streets with no memory of leaving her quarters. These nocturnal wanderings always led to locations significant in her relationship with Hiroshi: the tea house where they first met, the bridge where he first declared his love, the shops where he purchased increasingly elaborate gifts that she was obligated to accept but could never truly appreciate. You observe Sayuri during one of her performances, noting the subtle changes that have marked her since Hiroshi's death and subsequent haunting. Her movements, while still technically perfect, carry a quality of disconnection, as if she's performing while part of her consciousness remains elsewhere. Her eyes, once known for their expressive warmth, now hold a distant quality that suggests someone struggling to maintain control over her own thoughts and actions. Between dance sequences, she pauses to listen to sounds that no one else can hear, her painted face showing fear that her professional training cannot entirely mask. The manifestations of Hiroshi's vengeful spirit grow more dramatic as the weeks pass. Residents of the Pleasure Quarter report seeing a translucent figure moving through the narrow alleys after midnight, his form wavering between the appearance of the living man and something far more disturbing. His clothes hang in tatters that suggest decay, but his eyes burn with an intensity that seems to illuminate the darkness around him. Most terrifying of all, his hands continue to tremble with the same desperate energy that characterized his final moments, reaching toward targets that exist beyond the physical realm. Sayuri's situation deteriorates as the spirit's influence over her strengthens. She begins speaking in voices not her own, sometimes addressing invisible presences with words of love and sometimes screaming rejections at empty air. Her carefully maintained appearance starts to suffer as she loses the ability to sleep peacefully, with dark circles under her eyes that no amount of cosmetics can fully conceal. Other geisha report finding her standing motionless in common areas, staring at nothing while tears stream down her cheeks for reasons she cannot explain. The spirit's presence manifests through environmental disturbances that affect the entire district. Candles extinguish themselves when Sayuri enters a room, while mirrors crack without apparent cause whenever she looks into them. Temperature drops follow her movements, creating pockets of Arctic air that make breath visible even during warm spring evenings. Most disturbing of all, the sound of a man weeping echoes through buildings when she's present, a mournful sound that seems to emanate from the walls themselves rather than any identifiable source. You witness the spirit's first direct manifestation during a performance at the Sakurate, when Hiroshi's ghostly form materializes behind Sayuri as she dances. His translucent figure moves in perfect synchronization with her choreography, but his gestures carry a possessive quality that transforms her elegant movements into something sinister. The audience recoils in terror as they realize they're watching not just a dance, but a supernatural claiming, with the dead man's spirit attempting to merge with the object of his obsession through forced participation in her art. The invisible hands that witnesses describe become increasingly physical in their manifestations. Sayuri develops bruises on her arms and shoulders that appear overnight, finger-shaped marks that suggest someone gripping her with desperate strength. Her kimonos tear in patterns that indicate pulling and grasping, while her elaborate hairstyles become disheveled by forces that exist beyond normal perception. The physical evidence of supernatural contact grows more pronounced with each passing night, creating visible proof of the spirit's growing power over her body and mind. Local authorities, baffled by reports of supernatural harassment, call upon Buddhist monk Tenzin from the nearby Sensoji temple to assess the situation. His initial investigation reveals the complex spiritual dynamics at play, with Hiroshi's obsessive love having created psychic bonds that death has only strengthened rather than severed. The monk explains that certain emotions, when experienced with sufficient intensity, can transcend the boundaries between life and death, creating connections that persist in defiance of natural law. Tenzin's attempts at spiritual intervention begin with protective rituals designed to shield Sayuri from the spirit's influence. You observe as he places blessed amulets throughout her quarters and performs cleansing ceremonies that fill the air with sanctified incense smoke. But these measures prove insufficient against an entity powered by emotions that burned with white-hot intensity even in life. The spirit adapts to each protective measure, finding new ways to reach through spiritual barriers to maintain contact with its obsession. The climactic confrontation comes when Tenzin attempts a direct banishment ritual in the room where Hiroshi died. The ceremony requires Sayuri's presence, as the spiritual bonds between her and the vengeful spirit make her participation essential to any successful exorcism. You watch as the monk begins his chanted prayers, while Hiroshi's ghost manifests with unprecedented clarity, its form solidifying until it appears almost corporeal in the candle-lit chamber. The battle between monk and spirit unfolds on multiple levels of reality, with Tenzin's sacred words creating barriers of sanctified sound, while Hiroshi's rage generates waves of supernatural energy that make the building shake on its foundations. The ghost speaks for the first time since its death, its voice carrying all the desperate longing and frustrated desire that consumed its mortal existence. It pleads its case with eloquence that reveals the intelligence and passion that once made Hiroshi attractive to those who knew him in life, but now twisted into something monstrous by the corruption of death and obsession. Sayuri becomes the focal point of the supernatural struggle, with both the protecting monk and the possessing spirit attempting to claim influence over her consciousness. Her body convulses as opposing forces battle for control, while her voice alternates between her own terrified whispers and the spirit's passionate declarations. The sight of her suffering galvanizes Tenzin's efforts, and his prayers take on new urgency as he realizes that failure to banish the spirit will result not just in continued haunting, but in the complete destruction of Sayuri's individual identity. The exorcism reaches its peak when Tenzin calls upon the power of Buddhist teachings about the nature of attachment and the suffering it creates. His words seem to reach something deeper than the spirit's rage, touching whatever remains of Hiroshi's original humanity beneath the layers of supernatural corruption. For a moment, the ghost's expression changes from one of possessive fury to one of recognition and regret, as if seeing clearly for the first time the horror of what his love has become. But the moment of clarity proves insufficient to overcome the spiritual momentum of months of obsessive haunting. The ritual appears to succeed initially, with the spirit's form beginning to fade and the oppressive atmosphere in the room starting to dissipate. However, you observe subtle signs that the banishment is incomplete, shadows that move independently of light sources, temperature fluctuations that suggest invisible presence, and most tellingly, the continued look of fearful awareness in Sayuri's eyes that indicates she can still sense something lurking just beyond normal perception. In the days following the attempted exorcism, the manifestations continue but with greater subtlety. The spirit has learned to hide its presence from direct observation while maintaining its influence over Sayuri through methods that bypass the monk's protective barriers. She continues to experience episodes of lost time, finding herself in locations she doesn't remember visiting, often discovering gifts that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of her preferences and habits. The most disturbing development is the gradual change in Sayuri's personality as the spirit's influence deepens. She begins expressing opinions and preferences that mirror those Hiroshi held in life, as if his consciousness is slowly merging with her own. Her artistic style changes to incorporate elements that reflect masculine perspectives on beauty and emotion, while her interactions with clients become strained by sudden displays of jealousy and possessiveness that have no apparent source in her own feelings. You document the ongoing harassment through careful observation of Sayuri's daily routine, noting how the spirit's presence manifests in increasingly sophisticated ways. Flowers appear in her room, arranged in patterns that spell out messages only she can read, while her personal belongings rearrange themselves overnight to reflect organizational systems that belong to Hiroshi's merchant sensibilities. Most chilling of all, she begins humming melodies that were his favorites, songs she claims not to recognize, even as she performs them with perfect accuracy. The other geisha in the quarter begin to distance themselves from Sayuri, not out of cruelty, but from the superstitious fear that proximity to her might expose them to similar supernatural attention. This isolation only strengthens the spirit's influence, as Sayuri finds herself increasingly dependent on the invisible presence that surrounds her with constant attention, even if that attention has become a form of spiritual imprisonment rather than genuine affection. Tenzin returns periodically to monitor the situation and perform maintenance rituals designed to weaken the spirit's hold, but his efforts meet with limited success. Each intervention forces the ghost to retreat temporarily, but it always returns with new strategies for maintaining its connection to its earthly obsession. The monk begins to speak of the possibility that some spiritual bonds are too strong to be severed by conventional means, requiring either the complete destruction of one consciousness or the acceptance of permanent supernatural coexistence. The seasonal cycles bring changes to the manifestations, with the spirit's power waxing during certain lunar phases and diminishing during others. Spring brings the most intense episodes, as if the renewal of life in the natural world somehow amplifies the ghost's desperate desire to reclaim its own existence through possession of Sayuri's living consciousness. Summer's heat seems to weaken the supernatural influence, providing brief periods of relative normalcy that offer tantalizing glimpses of what life might be like if the haunting could be permanently ended. As autumn arrives, you observe that Sayuri has begun to age at an accelerated rate, as if the constant spiritual parasitism is draining her life force to sustain the ghost's manifestations. Her famous beauty starts to fade, not with the natural gradual process of time, but with the rapid deterioration of someone whose vital energy is being consumed by forces beyond her control. The spirit seems unaware that its demands for connection are destroying the very person it claims to love, or perhaps it no longer cares as long as it can maintain some form of contact with the physical world. Your final observation comes during the winter solstice, when the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead traditionally reaches its thinnest point. The spirit manifests with unusual clarity, its form solidifying until it appears almost corporeal in the candle-lit chamber where it first died. For a brief moment, you see not a monster driven by supernatural obsession, but the ghost of a young man whose love burned so intensely that it consumed not only his own life, but threatens to destroy the life of the woman he claimed to cherish above all else. The tragedy of Hiroshi and Sayuri serves as a cautionary tale about the destructive potential of love when it becomes obsession, passion when it ignores the autonomy of its object, and devotion when it refuses to accept the boundaries imposed by death itself. The spirit continues its haunting not out of malice, but from a twisted form of affection that has become indistinguishable from possession, while Sayuri remains trapped between the world of the living and the realm of the dead by bonds forged in emotions too intense for either life or death to contain. The pleasure quarter adapts to the presence of supernatural forces as it has adapted to countless other challenges over the centuries, but the cost of this adaptation is measured in lives disrupted, careers destroyed, and the gradual erosion of the boundaries that separate the natural from the supernatural. Hiroshi's ghost represents not just individual tragedy, but a fundamental violation of the cosmic order, a reminder that some forms of love are too dangerous to be allowed full expression, whether in life or in whatever existence lies beyond the grave. In the depths of the Yamashiro forest in 1856, locals whispered of an abandoned cabin where Geisha once performed private entertainments for wealthy patrons, until the night when ancient serpent spirits claimed the dwelling as their own, transforming visitors into scaled creatures that haunted the woodland shadows with anguished cries that echoed through the trees like warnings from the damned. The very mention of Hebi no Yakata, the Serpent's Lodge, was enough to make even the bravest woodsmen cross themselves and choose longer paths through safer terrain. You venture into the forest as autumn mist clings to the massive cedar trunks that have stood sentinel over these mountains for centuries. The path to the cabin winds through terrain that seems deliberately designed to confuse and disorient travelers, with landmarks that appear and disappear based on viewing angle and atmospheric conditions. Ancient trees lean inward to create tunnels of perpetual twilight, while the forest floor remains damp despite weeks without rain, squelching underfoot with each step toward your destination. The cabin's history reaches back to the early 1800s, when a wealthy merchant named Tanaka built it as a secret retreat where he could enjoy private performances by geisha away from the social constraints of urban society. The structure was designed to accommodate intimate gatherings, with multiple rooms arranged around a central performance space where artists could display their skills in dance, music, and conversation without the formalities required in more public venues. For 2 decades, the cabin served its intended purpose, hosting celebrations that became legendary among those privileged enough to receive invitations. But Tanaka's obsession with privacy and exclusivity led him to seek entertainment that transcended conventional boundaries, eventually attracting the attention of practitioners of forbidden arts who promised experiences beyond anything available in legitimate establishments. These individuals, claiming descent from ancient shamanic traditions, offered ceremonies that would allow participants to commune directly with primal forces that existed before human civilization established its dominion over the natural world. You first glimpse the cabin through gaps in the forest canopy, its wooden structure appearing to emerge from the earth itself rather than having been built upon it. The traditional architecture shows clear signs of abandonment, roof tiles displaced by growing vines, walls stained by decades of moisture, and windows that reflect not the surrounding forest but something darker and more disturbing. The building seems to pulse with its own rhythm, expanding and contracting slightly, as if breathing through wooden lungs that have learned to sustain themselves on atmospheric fear. The approach to the cabin's entrance requires careful navigation around what appears to be a garden that has reverted to wilderness, but closer inspection reveals deliberate patterns in the vegetation's growth. Plants arrange themselves in spiral configurations that hurt to follow with the eyes, while flowers bloom in colors that exist nowhere else in nature. Most unsettling of all, the paths between plant beds form symbols that predate written language, characters that seem to shift position when observed peripherally. As you step across the threshold into the cabin's interior, the atmosphere changes dramatically from the fresh forest air to something thick and humid that carries scents of musk, scales, and ancient earth. The wooden floors, once polished to mirror brightness, now show patterns of staining that suggest the regular presence of substances not entirely natural. Furniture remains in place but bears modifications that indicate adaptation to occupants whose anatomy differs significantly from standard human proportions. The main performance space reveals the true horror of what transpired during the cabin's final years of operation. The stage where Geisha once danced now bears a circular depression filled with what appears to be shed skin, layers upon layers of translucent material that rustles with each air current. The walls display paintings that seem to move in peripheral vision, depicting scenes of transformation where human figures gradually acquire reptilian characteristics through processes that appear both agonizing and ecstatic. Evidence of the supernatural corruption that claim the cabin appears throughout the structure in forms that challenge rational explanation. Mirrors reflect not your image but suggestions of scaled creatures that move with predatory grace, while shadows on the walls writhe with movements that have no corresponding sources. Most disturbing of all, you begin to hear the sounds that originally drew attention to the cabin's cursed nature. Weeping that seems to emanate from the walls themselves, punctuated by the distinctive whisper of scales against wood that suggests the presence of creatures too large to be natural serpents. The transformation process that claimed the cabin's final visitors appears to have been gradual rather than instantaneous, based on personal effects found throughout the building. Clothes show evidence of modification to accommodate changing body shapes, with sleeves and legs that have been lengthened while torsos remain unchanged. Shoes bear tooth marks from feet that have developed claws, while mirrors contain scratches at heights that suggest their users grew significantly taller during their metamorphosis. You discover journals written by some of the transformation victims, their handwriting becoming increasingly erratic as their fingers elongated and developed scales that interfered with grip strength. The accounts describe sensations of burning beneath the skin, followed by periods of euphoric expansion of consciousness that allowed communication with ancient intelligences that exist in dimensions parallel to our own. The final entries, barely legible, speak of transcendence through dissolution of human limitations, suggesting that the victims welcomed their transformation even as it destroyed their fundamental humanity. The serpent spirits that claimed the cabin appear to represent forces that predate human civilization, entities that view mammalian consciousness as a temporary aberration in the natural order. Through the transformation process, they seek to reclaim human consciousness for what they consider a more authentic existence, one that prioritizes survival instincts and sensory awareness over the abstract reasoning that defines modern human experience. The horror lies not in their malevolence but in their alien perspective that views human suffering as irrelevant to cosmic purposes. As night falls over the forest, the cabin's supernatural activity intensifies dramatically. The sounds of movement within the walls become more pronounced, suggesting the presence of creatures that have grown to considerable size during their years of inhabitation. Temperature fluctuations create condensation patterns on surfaces that form symbols reminiscent of ancient fertility rituals, while bioluminescent traces appear on walls and floors, marking territories according to rules that exist beyond human understanding. The first direct manifestation of the serpent spirits occurs when you enter the room where the original transformation ceremonies took place. The air fills with the sound of scales sliding against scales, while shadows begin coiling around the room's perimeter with movements too fluid for anything possessing a spine. Most terrifying of all, you feel the first sensations of the transformation process beginning in your own body, a tingling beneath the skin that suggests cellular changes are already underway despite minimal exposure to the cabin's influence. Your escape from the immediate transformation threat comes through the intervention of Kurata-sama, an elderly curandero whose reputation for dealing with ancient curses extends throughout the mountain provinces. His arrival at the cabin appears perfectly timed, but you later learn that he has been monitoring the site for years, waiting for someone to accidentally trigger the dormant forces that sleep within its walls. His weathered face shows no surprise at the supernatural manifestations you describe, suggesting familiarity with horrors that would drive ordinary individuals to madness. Kurata-sama's approach to containing the serpent spirits differs significantly from conventional exorcism techniques, focusing on negotiation rather than banishment. He explains that these entities are too ancient and powerful to be destroyed through human spiritual authority, requiring instead careful management that acknowledges their legitimate claim to portions of the natural world while establishing boundaries that protect human populations from unwilling transformation. The containment ritual begins at dawn, when the boundary between night and day offers optimal conditions for establishing supernatural barriers. Kurata-sama arranges protective amulets throughout the cabin, according to patterns derived from shamanic traditions that predate organized religion, while his chanted mantras create vibrations that resonate with frequencies beyond normal human hearing. The very air begins to thicken with sanctified energy that makes breathing difficult, but provides protection against the cellular changes that exposure to serpent spirits can trigger. The climactic confrontation occurs when the serpent spirits manifest in response to the curanderos' challenge to their territorial claims. Their forms remain largely invisible to human perception, but their presence becomes undeniable through environmental effects that include rapid temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic disturbances that make metal objects vibrate, and atmospheric pressure changes that cause physical discomfort. Most unnervingly, they communicate through direct telepathic contact that bypasses normal linguistic processing, flooding consciousness with images and sensations that convey meaning more directly than words. Through this supernatural dialogue, Kurata-sama negotiates terms that will allow the serpent spirits to maintain their claim to the cabin while preventing them from actively hunting human prey throughout the surrounding forest. The agreement requires the establishment of warning systems that will alert potential visitors to the dangers they face, while also creating spiritual barriers that will contain the transformation energies within the cabin's immediate vicinity. The ritual's conclusion involves the creation of a supernatural seal that locks the cabin's doors and windows against casual entry while allowing the serpent spirits to continue their existence within the structure. Black portals that served as gateways for the ancient entities are closed through complex geometric patterns drawn with blessed materials, their dark openings sealed behind barriers that pulse with protective energy. The curandero warns that these seals will weaken over time, requiring periodic renewal by practitioners with sufficient spiritual authority to safely approach the contained dangers. In the days following the containment ritual, you observe the gradual stabilization of the supernatural disturbances that have plagued the forest for decades. Animals begin returning to areas they had previously avoided, while the oppressive atmosphere that once made travel through this region so difficult finally dissipates. But subtle signs remain that the serpent spirits continue their existence within the sealed cabin, including bioluminescent traces that occasionally appear on the building's exterior walls and signs of movement that suggest ongoing activity within the contained space. The local population receives news of the containment with mixed reactions, expressing relief that the immediate supernatural threat has been neutralized while remaining concerned about the long-term stability of the spiritual barriers. Village elders who remember the cabin's original purpose speak of the tragic irony that a place designed for artistic beauty and human pleasure became a focal point for forces that view human consciousness as raw material for alien transformation projects. Your departure from the forest carries with it the understanding that some supernatural threats are too powerful to be eliminated entirely, requiring instead ongoing vigilance and periodic intervention to maintain the boundaries between human and inhuman realms. The serpent spirits that claim the cabin represent forces that existed long before human civilization and will likely persist long after it has passed into history. Patient intelligences that view mortal lifespans as brief interruptions in cosmic processes that operate according to timescales measured in geological epochs. The sealed cabin stands as both warning and monument, a reminder that human exploration of supernatural realms carries risks that extend beyond individual safety to threaten the fundamental nature of human consciousness itself. The transformation processes developed by the serpent spirits offer tantalizing glimpses of enhanced sensory awareness and expanded physical capabilities, but at the cost of everything that defines human identity and social connection. Kurata-sama's successful containment of the supernatural threat demonstrates that ancient knowledge traditions retain practical applications in modern contexts, but also reveals the precarious nature of the barriers that separate ordinary reality from dimensions where different rules govern existence. The curandero's warnings about the temporary nature of the spiritual seals serve as reminders that each generation must take responsibility for maintaining protections against forces that view human civilization as a temporary aberration in the natural order. The forest gradually heals from the supernatural contamination that emanated from the cabin during its years of uncontrolled supernatural activity. But certain areas retain sensitivity to otherworldly influences that make them unsuitable for human habitation. Trees that grew too close to the cabin's influence show bark patterns that resemble scales, while streams that once carried pure mountain water now have a mineral content that suggests contact with underground sources heated by processes that conventional geology cannot explain. The story of the cursed geisha cabin serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of seeking experiences that transcend normal human limitations, particularly when such quests involve contact with intelligences that operate according to moral frameworks incompatible with human values. The serpent spirits that claimed the structure offered genuine transformation and expanded consciousness, but their gifts came with prices that recipients only understood after the payment process had become irreversible. In the end, the cabin's containment represents not victory over supernatural forces, but rather the successful negotiation of a supernatural treaty that allows both human and inhuman intelligences to coexist within the same geographic region, while maintaining appropriate boundaries. The sealed building continues to pulse with alien life, its windows occasionally glowing with bioluminescent traces that suggest ongoing activity within, but the transformation energies that once threatened to spread throughout the forest remain safely contained behind barriers that honor both human safety and the legitimate territorial claims of entities whose existence predates recorded. In the Yoshiwara district of Tokyo in 1869, the infamous black kimono known as Kokuyo no Koromo had claimed the souls of 7 geisha across 3 generations, its midnight silk woven with forbidden symbols that drained the life force from anyone who dared wear it, leaving behind empty shells that walked through their final days like beautiful corpses animated by malevolent will. The garment's dark reputation spread through whispered warnings among the flower houses, but its terrible beauty continued to seduce new victims who believed they could master its power. You arrive at the Hanakoji Okiya during the height of cherry blossom season, when the district should be celebrating the peak of its artistic calendar. Instead, you find the geisha house shrouded in an atmosphere of dread that has persisted since Akemi, the house's most promising young performer, was discovered collapsed in her room 3 days earlier. Her body remained alive, but her eyes held no recognition, no spark of consciousness, as if something essential had been extracted from her being while she slept. The kimono's history traces back to 1847, when master weaver Yamada Kiyoshi created it for his daughter Chiyo, a geisha of extraordinary talent whose performances drew admirers from across the empire. Kiyoshi had studied forbidden textile techniques during his travels through remote mountain villages, learning from craftsmen who claimed their methods could infuse fabric with supernatural properties. The silk came from silkworms fed on plants that grew only in graveyards, while the dyes were mixed with materials that no respectable merchant would identify. Chiyo wore the kimono for her final performance, a dance that witnesses described as transcendent beyond human capability. Her movements flowed with impossible grace, while her voice carried harmonies that seemed to originate from multiple sources simultaneously. But as the performance reached its climax, observers noticed that Chiyo's expressions became increasingly vacant, as if her consciousness was being drawn out of her body with each gesture. She completed the dance but collapsed immediately afterward, her mind empty of everything that had once made her human. You examine the kimono in the Okiya's storage room, where it hangs like a shadow given form. The silk appears to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a void in the visual field that hurts to observe directly. The embroidered symbols scattered across its surface shift position when viewed peripherally, forming patterns that suggest ancient characters from languages that predate written history. Most disturbing of all, the fabric seems to breathe with its own rhythm, expanding and contracting as if it contains lungs that no longer require a living body to sustain them. Madame Otoki, the Okiya's proprietress, reveals the kimono's journey through her establishment with obvious reluctance. Each geisha who wore it achieved unprecedented artistic heights during their brief periods of possession, creating performances that established their reputations as legends of their craft. But this artistic transcendence came at a price that became apparent only after the garment was removed, the complete evacuation of individual personality, leaving behind bodies that could perform their duties but no longer contained the souls that once animated them. The supernatural mechanics of the kimono's curse operate through direct contact with human skin, establishing connections that bypass normal spiritual defenses. Within hours of being worn, victims report sensations of hollowness in their chest, as if something vital is being slowly extracted through invisible straws. Emotions become muted, memories grow distant, and the capacity for independent thought gradually diminishes until only the skills necessary for artistic performance remain intact. You witness the kimono's continuing influence on Akemi as she moves through her daily routines with mechanical precision. Her tea ceremony techniques remain flawless, but lack the subtle personal touches that once distinguished her style. Her conversations follow proper forms but carry no emotional resonance, while her painted face maintains perfect composure because no genuine feelings remain to disturb its artificial serenity. She has become a living doll, beautiful and skilled, but fundamentally empty of the consciousness that once made her human. The other geisha in the house watch Akemi's condition with mixture of pity and terror, understanding that her fate awaits anyone who succumbs to the kimono's seductive promise of artistic perfection. They speak in whispers about the garment's ability to enhance creative abilities beyond natural limits, but also about the gradual dissolution of self that accompanies such enhancement. Several admit to being tempted by the kimono's power despite knowing the consequences, suggesting that its influence extends beyond direct contact to affect anyone in its proximity. Buddhist monk Shinkai arrives at the Okiya, summoned by urgent requests for spiritual intervention before the kimono can claim additional victims. His examination of the cursed garment reveals the sophisticated nature of its supernatural properties, with the forbidden symbols serving as anchors for entities that exist in dimensions where consciousness can be harvested and stored like grain in spiritual warehouses. The monk explains that the kimono functions as both lure and trap, offering artistic transcendence to attract victims before draining their essential selves to feed the intelligences that inhabit its silk fibers. The purification ritual begins at midnight, when the barrier between the physical and spiritual worlds reaches its thinnest point. Monk Shinkai arranges blessed candles around the kimono in patterns derived from esoteric Buddhist texts that deal specifically with possessions involving inanimate objects. His chanted sutras create vibrations that make the garment writhe as if in pain, while incense smoke forms geometric shapes that seem to bind the fabric's supernatural properties within increasingly tight constraints. As the ceremony intensifies, the kimono's true nature becomes horrifyingly apparent. The silk begins to move with muscular contractions that suggest the presence of something alive within its fibers, while the embroidered symbols glow with bioluminescent light that reveals their true complexity. Most disturbing of all, voices begin emanating from the fabric, the whispered pleas of previous victims whose consciousness remains trapped within the garment's supernatural matrix, begging for release from their textile prison. The monk's prayers reach a crescendo as he attempts to sever the spiritual anchors that bind the harvested souls to their fabric prison. The kimono resists violently, levitating from its display stand while emitting sounds like tearing silk mixed with human screams. The temperature in the room plummets until breath becomes visible, while shadows begin moving independently of their light sources, suggesting that the entities inhabiting the garment are manifesting partial physical forms in their desperation to maintain control over their accumulated power. The climactic moment arrives when Monk Shinkai focuses his accumulated spiritual energy into a direct assault on the kimono's supernatural matrix. His final prayer, spoken in Sanskrit that predates the Buddhist traditions of Japan, creates sound waves that seem to unravel the fabric's cursed properties at the molecular level. The garment's violent movements gradually subside as the entities within it are forced to release their hold on the trapped consciousness they have been using as spiritual fuel. but the purification ritual proves only partially successful. While the monk manages to free most of the souls trapped within the kimono's supernatural matrix, the fundamental curse woven into its fibers during creation proves too deeply embedded to eliminate entirely. The garment becomes dormant rather than cleansed, its malevolent properties suppressed but not destroyed, like a disease driven into remission rather than cured completely. The ritual's aftermath brings mixed results for the Okia's residents. Akemi shows signs of gradual recovery as her drained consciousness slowly regenerates, but she retains no memories of her time under the kimono's influence and must relearn basic social interactions as if awakening from a coma. The other geisha experience relief that the immediate supernatural threat has been contained, but also mourn the loss of the artistic enhancement that the cursed garment provided to its victims. Monk Shinkai's solution to the ongoing threat involves containing rather than destroying the kimono, recognizing that its supernatural properties are too dangerous to leave accessible, but too powerful to risk attempting complete destruction. He oversees the construction of a specially blessed storage box made from wood taken from trees that have grown in temple grounds for over a century, their timber infused with decades of accumulated prayer and meditation. The containment process requires multiple layers of spiritual protection, with the kimono wrapped in silk blessed by dozens of monks before being placed within the sacred box. Protective sutras copied in the monk's own hand line the container's interior, while talismans created from blessed metals form geometric patterns that create supernatural barriers around the contained garment. The completed storage system resembles a shrine more than a simple box, its exterior covered with protective symbols that pulse with spiritual energy. You observe the final sealing ceremony as Monk Shinkai places the last protective barrier around the contained kimono. His prayers create visible distortions in the air around the sacred box, while the spiritual energy required for the containment process visibly ages him by years in a matter of hours. His warnings about the temporary nature of the supernatural prison echo through the Okiya like prophetic pronouncements, reminding everyone present that vigilance must be maintained indefinitely to prevent the curse from breaking free. The sealed box finds its final resting place in a hidden shrine room constructed specifically for containing dangerous supernatural artifacts. The chamber's walls bear protective symbols carved by master craftsmen who specialized in spiritual defense, while the floor forms a complex mandala designed to channel and dissipate any leaked supernatural energy. Access to the room requires keys held by 3 different religious authorities, ensuring that no single individual can unseal the container without collective agreement from multiple spiritual institutions. Despite the elaborate containment measures, subtle signs suggest that the kimono's influence continues to seep through its supernatural prison. Geisha in the Okiya report dreams filled with visions of impossible beauty and artistic perfection, tempting them with promises of transcendent creative achievement. Some wake with unexplained knowledge of dance techniques they never learned, while others find themselves humming melodies that seem to originate from sources beyond human composition. The Okiya adapts to its new reality as guardian of a contained supernatural threat, with daily routines modified to include protective rituals and regular monitoring of the shrine room for signs of containment failure. The residents understand that they have inherited a responsibility that extends beyond their individual lifespans, requiring them to pass warnings and protective knowledge to future generations who will continue the vigil against the kimono's eventual escape attempts. Your final days in the district reveal the broader impact of the kimono's presence on the Yoshiwara's artistic community. Other geisha houses share similar stories of cursed objects and supernatural influences, suggesting that the pursuit of artistic perfection often attracts entities that view human creativity as raw material for their own incomprehensible purposes. The kimono represents not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of supernatural predation that targets those who dedicate their lives to beauty and artistic expression. The economic implications of housing a contained supernatural threat become apparent as the Okiya struggles to maintain its reputation while dealing with the practical challenges of supernatural containment. Clients remain wary of the establishment despite assurances that the immediate danger has passed, while staff turnover increases as new employees prove unable to cope with the ongoing spiritual tensions that permeate the building. Akemi's gradual recovery provides hope that the Kimono's victims can be restored to some semblance of normal existence, but also reveals the permanent changes that supernatural contact creates in human consciousness. She demonstrates enhanced sensitivity to spiritual phenomena that allows her to detect supernatural threats before others become aware of them, but also experiences chronic nightmares filled with memories that may belong to other victims whose consciousness was temporarily merged with her own. Your departure from the Okia carries with it the knowledge that artistic beauty and supernatural danger often intertwine in ways that challenge simple moral categories. The kimono offered genuine enhancement of creative abilities, transforming ordinary performers into artists of legendary skill, but demanded payment in the form of human consciousness itself. The tragedy lies not in simple evil, but in the terrible bargain that the garment represents: transcendence through surrender of self. The contained kimono serves as a monument to the complex relationship between human ambition and supernatural forces, demonstrating that some forms of artistic achievement come with prices too high for mortal consciousness to pay. Its continued existence within the sacred containment system reminds future generations that beauty and horror often share the same source, and that the pursuit of perfection can lead to encounters with entities that view human souls as nothing more than fuel for their own alien purposes. In the end, the Okia's transformation into a guardian institution represents both victory and ongoing burden, successful containment of immediate supernatural threat balanced against the permanent responsibility for preventing future catastrophes. The kimono sleeps in its sacred prison, its malevolent consciousness suppressed but not destroyed, waiting with the patience of centuries for the moment when human carelessness or ambition will provide it with another opportunity to resume its harvesting of artistic souls.